What we saw last Sunday is that Job is a wealthy, upright individual who suffers terrible, terrible loss. He loses everything: his children, his wealth, and his health. And we're told that his suffering is entirely undeserved. Through a perspective that Job doesn't have access to, we're told that Satan's influence and power is real, and that through it all, the Lord reigns. Although that's most of the story, it doesn't even begin to tell the whole story of this ancient book, because between chapters 2 and 42, there are 39 chapters of poetic dialogue as Job wrestles, agonizes, complains to God and with God and against God as he struggles to comprehend what's happened to him and what it all means. And the question that drives Job chapter 3 is precisely the question that you or I would expect him to ask, the question that we ask when we experience suffering, or perhaps even more pointedly, when we see a loved one suffering. It's there in verse 11 and verse 12 and verse 16, and again in verse 20, verse 23. It's the question, why? For many people, the existence of suffering and evil in the world is the biggest obstacle to faith in God. Maybe you've had a conversation with someone who said to you, if God loves us, why did he allow whatever it was to happen? Why did he allow that illness or that accident or that abuse to happen to somebody that I love and know? And it's not uncommon. I've often found people who are angry with God, even those who would say that they don't believe in him, they are still angry that he's allowed terrible suffering to take place. It's been said that the question why can be asked in one of two ways. It can be asked philosophically, conceptually, as people ponder the existence of evil and suffering at an abstract or conceptual or philosophical level. But it can also be asked when we are experiencing all of that directly. Sometimes we ask that question why as spectators, sometimes we ask it as participants. And it might be that for some of us, we're going through that right now. I'm conscious that as we talk about subjects and questions as serious as these, for some of us, old wounds might start feeling fresh again. Or questions that we thought we had resolved and moved on from begin to form once more. Maybe the question why has been hanging over us for some years, and the lack of resolution is starting to feel a little troubling. We're going to do something a little different with our time this morning. Christians are instructed in the New Testament to be people who weep with those who weep. So this morning, we're going to weep with Job as we find him in chapter 3 in agony and turmoil and distress. What that means is simply that the sermon is going to be a little shorter than usual. I'm just going to say 3 things about Job chapter 3, and then we'll have an extended time of reflection. That will include 2 poems being read and a piece of music. Because before we get to all of the answers that we might want, before we get to explanations, before we get to reasons, we're to be people who weep with those who weep. So here's the first thing that I want to say this morning, and really it's the main point for this morning, and the one thing that I'd like us to take away, and it is that in this lament in Job chapter 3, in his ongoing protestations and complaints through the rest of the book, Job shows us that a real believer may go through the darkest despair and desperation and yet remain a real believer. So lament, indignation, confusion, outrage, anger are all proper responses to suffering and tragedy. Now, that's made clear to us, I think, as we look at the book as a whole. If we take a wide-angle step back and look at the whole book, when we get to the end of the story, God says that Job has spoken rightly about him. Not just in chapters 1 and 2, but all the way through, as Job has pleaded his cause, as he has asked for God to stand on trial to explain what's happening to him, as he's lamented the day of his birth, as he does in chapter 3, the narrator tells us that Job has not sinned with his lips. Both God and the narrator affirm Job. He is not suffering because he deserves it, and neither is his response to suffering illegitimate. As Job laments his appalling loss in the strongest, most graphic terms he could in Job chapter 3, he does so as a believer who is affirmed by God, which tells us that it's entirely possible for a blameless, upright follower of Jesus to go through very deep darkness and yet remain a believer. Doing some reading this week around Job chapter 3, I encountered the story of the poet and hymn writer back in the 17th century, William Cowper. His work was profoundly admired by later poets like Coleridge and Wordsworth, and he gave voice to much of the thinking that underpinned the abolitionist movement that saw an end to the Atlantic slave trade. He was often quoted by Martin Luther King. But Cowper's life was deeply, deeply tragic. He lost his mother at the age of 6 and was sent to a boarding school where he was so badly bullied that he never really recovered. He endured a number of psychotic episodes in later life that saw him committed to an institution that was run by evangelical Christians. There he was converted and became close to John Newton, and through the rest of his life wrote many of the poems that made him famous and some of the hymns that we still sing today. But even after his conversion, which appeared to be deep and genuine, he continued to suffer deep, dark periods of depression. And a few days before his death, one of the last things he said was, "I am in unutterable despair." Looking back at our sermon last week and Job chapters 1 and 2, I think one of the dangers that we face is that we are instinctively drawn to Job's great statements of faith in chapters 1 and 2. If you flick back in your Bibles to page 509 and Job chapter 1 and verse 21, Job says, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." Then on into chapter 2 and verse 10, as he's in that perplexing conversation with his wife, he says, "Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" They're amazing, amazing statements of faith, incredible things to say when Job is suffering deep darkness and loss. But I think the danger that we face is that we read statements like that and we are instinctively drawn towards them as the only legitimate response to make when we experience suffering and tragedy. That trusting, persevering, bearing up through the most extreme circumstances is what Job did, therefore it's what we should do. He suffered, he trusted, so should we, and that's the end of the story. But if Job is blameless in what he says in chapters 1 and 2, he's also blameless in what he says in chapter 3. The despair to which Job gives voice in chapter 3 is the experience of many true believers down the ages. We need to remember that because the darkness of Job chapter 3 is very dark indeed. And it's the darkness that some believers walk through today. And it remains very dark indeed. As we come to look at the chapter in a little more detail then, notice firstly that Job seems to be without hope in these verses. He seems to be without hope. He isn't able to look forward to anything, As he reflects, as he laments, he is only able to look back. So he begins with a curse in verses 3 to 10. Not cursing God, but cursing the day of his birth and the night that he was conceived. He wishes that those days, those events were covered not by light and rejoicing, as is normal when a baby arrives, but by darkness. If God is the God who brought light into darkness in Genesis chapter 3, Job is wishing for the undoing of creation, the undoing of his own creation. Likewise, darkness brings to mind the darkness that covers the land of Egypt during the Exodus. It's as if he wants the record of his own birth and conception expunged, forgotten, overwritten, wiped out. In his desperation, all that he can say is, "It would have been better if I had never existed." And that's the voice of despair. I simply wish I wasn't here. And despair, of course, is the denial of hope. Hope looks forwards, but despair can only look backwards, to relive or rewrite or even erase the past. It can't look forwards to allow any light in. Job is just in agony. You might have watched it over Christmas because it is something of a Christmas classic. But if you've never seen it, the Frank Capra film, It's a Wonderful Life, is based on the premise of someone who wishes that they had never been born, being shown a world, what the world would be like without them in it. The guardian angel gives a man called George Bailey a tour of his town without him in it, and he gets to see the difference that he's made to people's life. And the town, obviously, would be much worse without George Bailey in it. That's the point of the film. But Job gets absolutely nothing like that comfort. And he can't look forward. He can't see anything that will make his circumstances better or anything that might change the way that he's feeling. He can only look backwards. He can't look forwards. Now, I think that's quite hard for us to hear, because if we're people who have read our Bibles and know the promises of the gospel, we know that the best is yet to come. The Christian hope is always that the best is yet to come. If we know and have read Romans chapter 8, verse 28, that through all things God is working for the good of those who love him, including their suffering, if we know the promise of the new creation that God will wipe away every tear when he restores all things and makes all things right, we know that the best is yet to come. But the point is that Job can't see it. He can't feel those promises. He can't hear or see any hope or look forwards. He can only look back. And that doesn't make him any less a believer. And I think we have to hold on to that, as uncomfortable as it might feel for us. Because the truth is that while the promises of the gospel are precious and true, and are a great source of joy and comfort for many who are in darkness, it might just be that when people are in Job's situation, they can't see them or feel them. And all they can do is look back. And if we don't know that or realize that, if we're not weeping with people who weep, it might be that in our good intention to say the right thing or to bring some Christian gospel hope, actually, we won't be any use if what we say doesn't come after our tears and weeping with those who weep. Because Job here in these verses is entirely without hope. And seemingly, he is also without God. As we read through Job chapter 3, I don't know if you noticed the references to God, but there was only one. God is noticeable in these verses only really by his absence. Job can't see past his circumstances, he can't look forwards, and he can see nothing or very little of God himself. Memorably, the academic and author C.S. Lewis, I think, captured something of what that feels like in his little book, A Grief Observed. Following the death of his wife, he just recorded his impressions of what grief is like and feels like. And in it, he says these words. He says, "Go to God when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain, and what do you find? A door slammed in your face, and the sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside, and then silence." And that's Job's experience in these verses. God is absent, almost entirely absent, has nothing to say that might comfort or reassure or bring words of hope. He is simply not there. Apart from the one reference that we do get to him in verse 23, Job says, "Why is life given to a man whose way is hidden, whom God has hedged in?" It's precisely at this point that I think there is a glimmer of hope, but it is only a glimmer, and it's a theme that we'll come back to later on. To carry on with Lewis's image, but perhaps to give it a slight twist, Job knows that he cannot turn away from the door that's been slammed in his face. He knows that at some level, it's precisely by his absence that God is present, that he must wait by the door, even in the depths of his agony and his misery. He must wait there because that's the point, even if it's not present, that there will be answers, that there will be some sense of hope and explanation. And in the depths of his misery, Job knows that before anything else, he must deal with God. He must deal with who God is and what he's like and his ways in the world. Job is not confronted by a philosophical problem or trying to answer a skeptic's question. He knows that he's got to deal with who God is. So where does that leave us? What does that mean for all of us? Well, if nothing else, as I said a little earlier, it leaves us as the people who must weep with those who weep. There might be things that we want to say to ourselves, to other people. There might be things that we know that we don't want to say to ourselves and to other people. There might be explanations, there might be apologies, there might be answers that we want to be able to give to those who are suffering, who are wrestling with precisely these kinds of questions. And as we go on with Job in the coming weeks, as we follow him through his own wrestling and doubt and confusion and questions, we might begin to get some shape. We might begin to get some sense of an answer. But we begin this morning in tears. We begin with Job where he is. We weep with him as people who weep with those who weep.
In his dark room, he is finally alone, with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. The only light is red and softly glows, as though this were a church and he a priest preparing to intone a mass. Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, all flesh is grass. He has a job to do. Solutions to slop in trays beneath his hands, which did not tremble then, though seem to now. Rural England, home again to ordinary pain which simple weather can dispel, to fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. Something is happening. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes. A half-formed ghost. He remembers the cries of this man's wife, how he sought approval without words to do what someone must, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. 100 agonies in black and white, from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday supplement. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. From the aeroplane, he stares impassively at where he earns his living, and they do not care.
O Lord, the God who saves me, day and night I cry out before you. May my prayer come before you. Turn your ear to my cry. For my soul is full of trouble, and my life draws near to the grave. I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I am like a man without strength. I am set apart with the dead, like the slain who lie in the grave, whom you remember no more, who are cut off from your care. You have put me in the lowest pit, in the darkest depths. Your wrath lies heavily upon me. You have overwhelmed me with all your waves. You have taken from me my closest friends and have made me repulsive to them. I am confined and cannot escape. My eyes are dim with grief. I call to you, O Lord, every day. I spread out my hands to you. Do you show your wonders to the dead? Do those who are dead rise up and praise you? Is your love declared in the grave, your faithfulness in destruction? Are your wonders known in the place of darkness, or your righteous deeds in the land of oblivion? But I cry to you for help, O Lord. In the morning my prayer comes before you. Why, O Lord, do you reject me and hide your face from me? From my youth I have been afflicted and close to death. I have suffered your terrors and am in despair. Your wrath has swept over me. Your terrors have destroyed me. All day long they surround me like a flood. They have completely engulfed me. You have taken my companions and loved ones from me. The darkness is my closest friend.